Listening Library presents Who Was Chuck Jones? By Jim Gigliotti. Illustrated by John Hinderleader. Who was Chuck Jones? Chuck Jones was 8 years old and living in Ocean Park, California, when a stray cat named Johnson walked up the sand to his back doorstep one summer day in 1921. Chuck had never seen the skinny, short-haired cat before. He called him Johnson, because that was the name written on a small wooden tag around the cat's neck. Chuck liked Johnson, and Johnson liked Chuck. So Johnson decided, as anyone with a cat knows, it was Johnson's idea to stay with the Jones family for a little while. Chuck laughed when Johnson would bat a grapefruit into a corner of the house, trapping it so he could bite into it and get it at the juicy inside. And he laughed when Johnson would jump into the ocean and climb onto the shoulders of an unsuspecting swimmer. And when Johnson, covered in bits of tar and seagull feathers, surprised a group of sunbathers on the beach one day. By watching Johnson, Chuck realized that animals have their own personalities, just like humans do. And he realized that it was the unexpected things in life that made people laugh. When Chuck grew up to direct cartoons, he often used animals to tell his stories. And not just any animals, but some of the most famous cartoon animals ever created. Bugs Bunny, Daffy Duck, the Roadrunner, Wile E. Coyote, Pepe Le Pew, Michigan J. Frog, and many more. His characters starred in short cartoons and feature-length cartoons, television shows, and movies. What made Chuck's cartoon characters so memorable was that each had its own special personality, just like Johnson. And each behaved in surprising ways, just like Johnson. A rabbit sang opera, a skunk fell in love with a cat, a frog broke into a song and dance routine, and a coyote tried all sorts of crazy ways to catch a roadrunner in the desert. And they all made people laugh. Many of Chuck's creations have entertained children and adults for more than 50 years. Chapter 1. Growing up in California. When Chuck Jones was a youngster, he loved stories. Chuck grew up before most people had radios and before television existed. But he enjoyed reading interesting books. He delighted in hearing the fantastic tales his relatives told. And he liked watching people act out funny performances on stage and in the movies. Chuck was born Charles Martin Jones in Spokane, Washington on September 21st, 1912. His father's name was also Charles. His mother's name was Mabel. His oldest sister, Margaret, was born in 1908. Another sister, Dorothy, was born in 1910. Chuck's father worked at many different jobs. When he first met Mabel in 1906, he worked for a railroad company. That company sent him to Panama for a while to help work on the Panama Canal. Margaret and Dorothy were born in Panama, but the family moved back to the United States to Spokane, Washington, shortly before Chuck was born. The family moved to Southern California in 1913, when Chuck was about 6 months old. Chuck's younger brother, Richard, was born 2 years later. Chuck's father wanted to open and run his own business. He had many different ideas about how to get started. Unfortunately, none of his businesses were very successful. He tried buying and selling land, growing flowers, even selling avocados, but nothing seemed to work out quite right. Every time Chuck's father started a new business, he ordered nice pencils and good paper on which he printed the name of his company. And every time the new company failed, he had stacks of paper and boxes of pencils left over. Since they all had the company name on them, they were no longer of any use to Mr. Jones. He always gave the paper and the pencils to his children. Chuck and his siblings usually had the best paper and the most pencils of any kids in their neighborhood, and they put it all to good use. Chuck drew at least 20 pictures every day for as long as he could remember. He was getting good at it too. Chuck's talent began to show at a very early age, his brother later said. Mabel encouraged her children to draw. She would never criticize their drawings, but she never praised them unless she really meant it, either. Instead, she just let them have fun with their artwork. It was a happy experience to draw for the joy of drawing, Chuck said. The Jones family moved several times throughout Southern California. They lived in and around the Hollywood area and sometimes out by the beach. Wherever the family moved, Chuck's father made sure that they rented a house that came with furniture and books already in place. And not just any books, Chuck said, but good books. To Chuck's father, that meant books by famous authors such as Charles Dickens, Mark Twain, and O. Henry. Mr. Jones thought that reading was very important. In fact, conversation was not permitted at breakfast, only reading was allowed. If one of the Jones children forgot to bring a book to the table, he or she could read the cereal box. So Chuck learned to read by the time he was 3 years old. As he grew, he went through all the good books in all their different houses, and the not so good ones too. When Chuck wasn't reading, he listened to his Uncle Lin tell stories. Uncle Lin told some pretty crazy tales. Sometimes they were just silly, like one about a zebra whose stripes had slipped off his back. At other times, the stories helped the kids feel better. When Teddy, the Jones family dog, died, Uncle Lin said that the dog had called him to say he was okay. Uncle Lin wasn't entirely sure where Teddy was calling from, but he thought it might have been from dog heaven. On some weekends, Chuck and Richard would visit Uncle Kent, who sold cars in downtown Los Angeles. Uncle Kent always gave the boys money to see a live vaudeville show. Vaudeville had many different performers on stage, one after another. The first might be an acrobat and the next a singer. Chuck liked the comedians best. He always enjoyed their funny skits and jokes. Chuck learned a lot about comedy from watching the vaudeville acts, and he learned from watching silent movies too. When Chuck was about 6 years old, his family moved to a house on Sunset Boulevard in Hollywood. The house was only a couple of blocks away from where movie star Charlie Chaplin built his own studio in 1918. Chuck sometimes sat outside and saw famous stars such as Chaplin or Mary Pickford or Lloyd Hamilton, the greatest stars of the silent movies, going to or from work. This was almost a decade before talking pictures, movies with sound, were invented. Charlie Chaplin, 1889 to 1977. Comic actor Charlie Chaplin was one of the earliest movie stars, and he's still one of the most famous performers of all time. Chaplin was born in London. He began his career on the stage in England when he was just a child. In 1914, he started acting in silent films in the United States. Chaplin was an instant hit as a comedian in silent films, and his character the Tramp, with his little mustache, funny walk, and bowler hat, is still recognized around the world. Chaplin soon began writing and directing films in addition to starring in them. In 1919, he helped form the United Artists movie company. He worked as a movie director and producer for nearly 50 years after that. In 1972, he was presented with an honorary Academy Award for his lifetime contributions to the movies. Chuck went to the movies and saw how funny Chaplin was. He laughed at common everyday things, like the funny way Chaplin walked. Chuck's dad told him that Charlie Chaplin once filmed a scene 132 times until he got it just right. Chuck wondered if that was true, and he wondered if a zebra's stripes could ever really fall down around its ankles. Chapter 2. On to art school. One of the houses in which Chuck lived, where he was growing up, included a collection of books by Mark Twain. Chuck read through the entire collection. One of the books was called Roughing It, was the story of a pair of brothers who crossed the United States in a stagecoach. Chuck read the book over and over. What he remembered most about it was Twain's detailed description of a coyote. Mark Twain, 1835 to 1910. Mark Twain is the pen name of an American author and humorist who wrote The Adventures of Tom Sawyer and Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. Twain, whose real name was Samuel Clemens, first became famous for the celebrated Jumping Frog of Calaveras County, a short story written in 1865. By the end of his career, he had written 28 books and many short stories and essays. Twain was in great demand as a public speaker, and he became one of the most famous men in the world. Mark Twain had described the coyote in Roughing It as being thin and scrawny, with funny-looking hair. Chuck thought that sounded like a pretty accurate description of himself. Chuck was so skinny in high school, he imagined that other people could see him only by looking straight at him, but not from the side. He was 6'1" and weighed only 125 pounds. Chuck wasn't confident about his looks, and he didn't like school. He didn't feel like he fit in. And although he was very smart, having read so much as a child, he was bored. Chuck earned good grades in the classes he liked. but he let his imagination roam in others. Before his junior year, his father took Chuck out of high school and enrolled him at Chouinard Art Institute in Los Angeles. It's now called the California Institute of the Arts, or sometimes just CalArts. That was okay with Chuck. He would call it his great good luck to leave high school for art school. On Chuck's first day at Chouinard, one of his teachers told the students that they all had 100,000 bad drawings in them, meaning they all would draw plenty of bad pictures before they learned to draw any good ones. That was okay with Chuck too. He felt that he'd been drawing for so long that he already was on his second batch of 100,000 bad drawings. A teacher named John Graham taught Chuck to develop his own style and work his way toward creating those good drawings. While students worked on their drawings, Graham did not praise or criticize. Instead, he asked, having fun for good work or having problems for not so good work? I would rather hear Don Graham say having fun than win an academic award, Chuck said. Chuck sometimes looked around at the other students and felt as if they were all pretty good artists, and he wasn't. Or, as he complained to Uncle Lin one day after school, "You can't make a racehorse out of a pig." That was true. Uncle Lin wisely told him, but you can make a very fast pig. In other words, he couldn't try to be something that he wasn't. I realized that was what it was all about, Chuck later said. There was no point in comparing himself to other students. Whatever Chuck decided to do with his life, he could only try to be the best that he could be. Chuck worked hard during his time at Chouinard. At 2 o'clock each morning, he would take a bus to work as a janitor cleaning a nearby office building. After 4 hours of work, he went to his classes. When his school day ended, he also cleaned a Chouinard to help pay his tuition. Like most of his classmates, Chuck hoped to become a famous artist one day. He dreamed of moving to Paris and creating famous paintings. But when Chuck graduated in 1931, it was difficult for anybody to find work, especially someone just getting out of school and with little experience. At the time, the United States was in the midst of the Great Depression. Many people lost their jobs and their homes and their life savings. Chuck had no idea how he was going to make a living after art school. Chapter 3: The Working World. Not long after Chuck graduated from Chouinard, a friend from school called to tell him that iWorks was hiring people to work at his animation studio. iWorks was the animator who had created Mickey Mouse just 3 years earlier while working with Walt Disney. iWorks had animated famous early Mickey Mouse cartoons such as Steamboat Willie and Skeleton Dance, but he had since opened his own business. Fortunately for Chuck, the movie industry wasn't as hurt by the Great Depression as almost industries had been. People still wanted to go to the movies. Chuck was only 18 years old when he was hired by iWorks in 1931. Art school had prepared Chuck well for a career in animation. Even though he didn't realize it at the time, the thousands of drawings he did in art school were like practice for creating all the drawings needed for a short cartoon. Drawing was what Chuck liked to do most, and what he was good at. Now someone was going to pay him to do it. Imagine that, he later said, and called it the most incredible thing that ever happened in the history of my life. Movie shorts. From the 1920s to the 1950s, the price of a movie ticket included a feature film and several short films such as comedies, cartoons, and newsreels. Movie shorts were usually under 10 minutes long and shown before the regular movie or in between the two movies of a double feature. By the mid-1950s, television had become quite popular. Movie shorts became a thing of the past. Because cartoon shorts had been created on film, they survived to be shown over and over again on television. But Chuck didn't start off as an animator, an artist right away. He had to work his way up from the bottom. And in those days, the bottom of the animation ladder was a cell washer. A cell, the name was derived from celluloid, was a hard, transparent plastic material on which drawings for animation were made. Cells were expensive. They cost about 7 cents each when Chuck started with iWorks. And a 7-minute cartoon might need tens of thousands of cells. Studios reused cells to save money. It was much less expensive to pay someone like Chuck about $15 a week to wash the old drawings off cells and reuse them instead of buying new ones each time. After 6 months as a cell washer, Chuck moved up to cell painter and then cell inker. Next, he became an in-betweener, drawing the frames in between the main images that were already done by the animators. Chuck worked for more than a year for iWorks, and he spent time at other studios too, but iWorks was struggling to make a profit. And in 1933, Chuck was fired. He said, by a secretary named Dorothy Webster. Chuck needed to find another job. He thought he would become a janitor once again. Then a friend from Chenard opened a small bookstore on Olvera Street in downtown Los Angeles. How animation works. Traditional animation, the kind that is hand-drawn, was standard before computers were used. It is a long process with many steps. It starts, of course, with a story. Once a story is approved, a script is written and the actors' voices are recorded. This is done first because animators match their drawings to the spoken words, not the other way around. Animators then make the most important drawings for each scene. An in-betweener fills in the less important drawings using the exact same style for each character and scene. Once all the drawings in the scene have been made, an inker copies the outline of the drawing onto a transparent cell. Then a painter fills in the colors of the character on the back side of the cell. Putting colors on the back side makes the character look sharper. Other artists have painted the backgrounds on separate cells. The cells are then photographed to create each image frame of the film with 12 to 24 frames making up a single second. It requires thousands of cells to make a 7-minute movie. The director of an animated film oversees every step of the process, working with a team he or she has assembled. assembled. With all the effort and expense that goes into producing a single scene, the director has to get it right the first time. Unlike a live-action movie, there are no second takes. Olvera Street is a Mexican-style marketplace in the oldest part of downtown Los Angeles. It has many people who sell food, crafts, and clothing, and it attracts many tourists. Chuck's friend asked him to draw portraits near his bookstore's entrance in the hopes that it would bring tourists into the shop. Chuck charged $1 per portrait. Chuck didn't think he drew people's faces very well, because he had trouble getting the eyes right, but he felt he could draw them reasonably well in profile, that is, from the side. He would simply try to make everyone look pretty. They go away happy, and I get my $1, he said. Chuck liked his work outside the bookstore. He enjoyed talking to people. Sometimes he earned a little extra money by helping the puppeteers on Olvera Street. The expert puppeteers taught him important lessons about the characters they controlled. If the marionette's knees bent or their feet weren't planted solidly on the ground, for instance, the performance looked sloppy. Chuck learned a lot about the right way for the marionettes to move. It was good practice for his career in animation. As enjoyable and as valuable as it was to work on Olvera Street, Chuck wasn't making enough money to pay his bills. Besides, he was in love and thinking about getting married and starting a family. His bride-to-be was Dorothy Webster, the same secretary who had fired him from Ironworks' studio. In 1933, Dorothy helped Chuck find a job with a movie studio called Leon Schlesinger Productions. Chuck began as an in-betweener at the new studio, and he and Dorothy were married in 1935. 2 years later, Dorothy gave birth to their first baby daughter, Linda. Chuck had a good job and a family. He was beginning a new chapter in his life. Chapter 4. What's up, Doc? Chuck continued to climb the animation ladder. In 1938, when he was just 25 years old, he became the youngest animation supervisor for Leon Schlesinger Productions. His days of washing cells were over. He had become a director. At Schlesinger Productions, Chuck worked on Looney Tunes and Merry Melodies cartoons for Warner Brothers Pictures, which bought Leon Schlesinger Productions in 1944. Merry Melodies and Looney Tunes were two series of funny short films produced from the early 1930s until the end of the 1960s, an era known as the Golden Age of animation. They both had been named after Walt Disney Productions' Silly Symphonies, but they would become more popular than Disney's or any other competitor's cartoons. Each Merry Melodies cartoon originally ended with a line, "So long, folks," and each Looney Tunes cartoon with the line, "That's all, folks." But by 1936, all the films for both series ended the same way. "That's all, folks." They also came to share the theme music, a 1937 song called "The Merry-Go-Round Broke Down." Chuck worked with a creative group of people in the animation department. They had a lot of fun at their jobs because the Warner Brothers bosses were not often around. One writer, Cal Howard, ran a hot dog stand out of his desk. Another acted as the lookout near the front entrance. If he saw one of their bosses coming, he would push a button under his desk that activated lights at the other employees' desks. Everyone quickly tried to look busy. Cal Howard delivered hot dogs to other floors in a basket that was pulled up and down by a rope on the outside of the building. One time, someone opened the window and used a metal hook to grab the basket and steal the food. The next time, Cal put a firecracker in the basket. No more stolen hot dogs. The Schlesinger animators worked in a building that was not near the main Warner Brothers studio and offices. The people who worked there called the Schlesinger building Termite Terrace because it was so old and needed repair, and also because of all the termites. Despite the condition of the building, the remote location had a good side. Chuck forged a close and creative working relationship with the other directors at Termite Terrace. He learned about making cartoons from animators such as Tex Avery, Friz Freleng, and Frank Tashlin, and he learned the importance of working together as a team. Tex Avery, 1908 to 1980. Fred Tex Avery was a legendary animator best known for his work with characters such as Bugs Bunny, Porky Pig, and Chilly Willy. He worked for Leon Schlesinger Productions from 1935 to 1941, then later for Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, MGM, and other studios. His nickname came from his hometown of Taylor, Texas. When Avery attended North Dallas High School, a common greeting among friends was, "What's up, Doc?" He added that to his first Bugs Bunny cartoon, A Wild Hare, in 1940, and it became the rabbit's most famous line. The first feature Chuck directed was called The Night Watchman in 1938. The Night Watchman features Tommy Cat, who tries to make sure the mice don't misbehave one night while his father, the regular night watchman, is out sick. Of course, the mice do misbehave. They take advantage of Tommy Cat until he fights back. The Night Watchman was fun to watch and had moments of charm, but it wasn't great. Instead, The Night Watchman was a learning experience for Chuck. "You have to stumble a lot," he said. "I can't think of any other way of doing anything. There are no shortcuts." Like The Night Watchman, much of Chuck's early work included gentle characters that were as realistic as possible, or at least as realistic as talking animals can be. They might make people smile, but not really laugh. Chuck was imitating the formula that had worked for Walt Disney in creating his characters, which included a character called Sniffles, a cute mouse drawn in the Mickey Mouse style. "I didn't know anything else to do but study the people who came before me," Chuck said later. In the 1940s, however, Chuck began to break away from the Disney formula and develop his own style of storytelling. A major turning point was The Draft Horse in 1942. World War II was in full swing by then. The United States had entered the war after Pearl Harbor in Hawaii was bombed in December 1941. Chuck directed the cartoon about a horse that rushes to enlist in the Army. The horse gets rejected and ends up knitting sweaters for soldiers. Chuck gave the horse a wacky personality and an energy not seen in his earlier films. When Chuck watched the draft horse in the theater, he was delighted to hear people laughing out loud. Once you have heard a strange audience burst into laughter at a film you directed, you realize what the word joy is all about, he said later. Chuck had discovered what he was best at. From then on, his stories wouldn't just give people a smile or a little chuckle here and there. They would make people roar with laughter. Chapter 5. The Bugs Bunny and Me. Not long after directing a cartoon about a horse that wanted to join the Army, Chuck began directing cartoons for people who really were in the Army. These cartoons served as training films for U.S. soldiers. They were funny films, but they served a serious purpose, to keep soldiers safe by teaching them the right way to do things. From 1943 to 1945, Chuck directed 12 of the 26 training films that Warner Brothers made for the U.S. Army. Many of them were written by Theodore Geisel, an author better known as Dr. Seuss. World War II training films covered topics such as firing a weapon or driving a tank. But some were not about fighting the war at all. The Army wanted Warner Brothers to make animated films because they knew that cartoons would be a funny way to get important points across. Chuck's military cartoons featured a young army man named Private Snafu. SNAFU is an old military acronym that stands for Situation Normal, All Fouled Up. Private Snafu does everything wrong. He goofs off instead of studying maps and charts. He doesn't protect himself from disease-carrying mosquitoes. Every time he does something wrong, he puts himself and other soldiers in danger by showing the men and women of the armed forces the wrong way to do things in a funny manner. Chuck taught them the right way to do things. The Private Snafu cartoons let Chuck try things he normally wouldn't have. Free from studio executives saying no, he took risks that he never did at his studio job, and the men and women of the military thought Private Snafu was hilarious. The films were important for Chuck because they gave him the courage to be bolder in his regular films. Chuck became more daring with Bugs Bunny and gave him the personality that made Bugs such a favorite. With Super Rabbit in 1943, by then, Bugs already had appeared in cartoons with several different directors, and just like with real-life actors, cartoon characters have a different personality when working with different directors. In Super Rabbit, you could see that Bugs, was really enjoying himself, which I enjoyed. Chuck said, "It was a matter of understanding the Bugs Bunny and me." Super Rabbit is based on the Superman cartoon series. Bugs battles a villain named Cottontail Smith who is trying to eliminate all rabbits. Just when Cottontail is about to get Bugs, the Super Rabbit emerges from a phone booth in the uniform of a real Superman, a member of the U.S. Marine Corps. Bugs has fun with Cottontail without ever being mean, and he is clearly enjoying himself. Fighting the bad guy is just a game for him. The cartoon ends with Bugs telling Cottontail and his horse, "Sorry, fellas, I can't play with you anymore. I've got important work to do." And he marches off to the battlefields of World War II. Chuck said Bugs was who he wanted to be. Stylish, funny, and always quick with a clever comeback line. "My admiration for Bugs is immeasurable," he once wrote. He would come home from work and tell his wife, Dorothy, the things that Bugs did that day, as if the cartoon character was a real person. The character of Bugs Bunny was real to many other people too. Once Chuck was introduced to a little boy as the man who drew Bugs Bunny. "He doesn't draw Bugs Bunny," the boy insisted. "He draws pictures of Bugs Bunny." When one of the men who wrote for Chuck explained his job to his own grandmother, she said, "I can't understand why you're writing scripts for Bugs Bunny. He's funny enough just as he is." While Chuck was hard at work on the Bugs Bunny cartoons, he was also creating his own characters from Looney Tunes. In 1945, he created Pepe Le Pew, a French skunk who is always looking for love, usually with a cat who does not feel the same way about him. Chuck saw the wishful side of himself in Pepe. He remembered being shy and uncertain around girls when he was younger. But Pepe was confident. "Pepe always represented the other side of my personality," Chuck said, "because he represented what I wanted to be, and what I think every man would like to be, irresistible." Pepe was usually rejected by the cats who he chased because, well, he was a skunk. Still, it never stopped him from trying. He appeared in 17 cartoons starting in 1945, with all but 3 of them directed by Jones. Pepe was Chuck's most famous creation to date, but Chuck soon would reach back to his childhood memories to create 2 even bigger stars. Chapter 6. Beep Beep. In 1949, Chuck came up with 2 of his best-known characters. He thought back to the coyote Mark Twain describing in Roughing It. What would a coyote like to eat for dinner? He thought. Maybe a roadrunner, if he was fast enough to catch one. The roadrunner and Wile E. Coyote were born. Say Wile E. fast. It sounds like Wile E., which means clever. Chuck came up with the idea for the roadrunner's sound from background artist Paul Julian. One day, Paul was walking down the hallway at Warner Brothers with some drawings. They were stacked so high that he couldn't see over them. "Beep beep," Paul called out so he wouldn't run into anybody. "Beep beep," Chuck asked Paul to be the voice of the roadrunner. The Roadrunner and the Coyote appeared in 26 cartoons directed by Chuck over the next 16 years, beginning with Fast and Furious. Other directors also worked with the characters after that. The formula was always the same. The Roadrunner runs along the desert highway. The Coyote tries to catch Roadrunner, but his clever tricks always backfire. He never catches Roadrunner, but the Coyote does injure himself a lot. The Roadrunner occasionally startles him with a well-timed beep beep before racing away. In fact, those are the only words that are ever said in the entire series of the Roadrunner and Coyote cartoons. In 1950, the same year that the Roadrunner and Coyote first appeared, 2 cartoons directed by Chuck won Academy Awards, a huge honor for anyone in the movie industry. For sentimental reasons, starring Pepe Le Pew won the award for Best Animated Short Film. Chuck's So Much for So Little won for Best Documentary Short Subject. So Much for So Little was a cartoon Chuck directed for the U.S. government's Public Health Service. It encouraged better health care for babies, and it was the first time that an Academy Award for a documentary was awarded to an animated film. The Acme Corporation. Wile E. Coyote tries to catch the Roadrunner with an assortment of wacky products that he orders from the Acme Corporation. Acme comes from a Greek word that means the very best of something, literally, the highest point. But the Acme Corporation's products are anything but the best. They always backfire on the Coyote just when he thinks he is closing in on the Roadrunner. Some of the Acme products that almost help the Coyote trap his dinner include an anvil, rocket-powered roller skates, a tornado kit, a giant rubber band, an instant icicle maker, and a rocket-powered sled. The Acme Corporation was completely made up, although there are real companies that use the name. In the early 1900s, the Sears Roebuck catalog sold several Acme products, including an anvil. Throughout the 1950s, Chuck continued to create even more memorable animal characters, each with a unique personality and character. Mark Antony was a huge bulldog who fiercely protected a cuddly kitten in Feed the Kitty, 1952. Michigan J. Frog wore a top hat and carried a cane while dancing and singing in One Froggy Evening, 1955. Such animals came from the memories Chuck had of his childhood. He remembered the funny way animals like Johnson, the grapefruit-loving cat, acted. Early experiences convinced me that animals can and do have quite distinct personalities, he said. Just as important, Chuck brought new and special personalities to already existing Warner Brothers characters, such as Daffy Duck. Under Chuck's direction, Daffy became the exact opposite of Bugs Bunny. While Bugs was confident and self-assured, Daffy was uncertain and fearful that everyone was out to get him. Duck Amuck, 1953, is Chuck's most famous work with Daffy Duck. In it, an unseen artist frustrates Daffy by constantly changing the scenery, sound effects, and costumes. Sometimes the illustrator's pencil erases Daffy or leaves him with only a face or even just a mouth. At the end, the artist, the animator of the cartoon, is revealed to be Bugs Bunny. "Gee, ain't I a stinker?" Bugs says into the camera. The real stinker behind the scenes, of course, was Chuck. If anyone was going to be an animated cartoon director, he said, they have to have the courage to reach down inside themselves and pull a character up to the surface and become that character. Chapter 7. Beyond Warner Brothers. Except for a few months when he briefly worked at Disney Studios, Chuck remained with Warner Brothers until the early 1960s. In 1962, he teamed with his wife Dorothy to write a full-length animated musical, Gay Prairie. Chuck had always delighted in Dorothy's beauty, curiosity, and sense of wonder. He also described their child, Linda, as the perfect daughter. Like everyone else at the time, Linda had grown up watching her dad's cartoons in the movie theaters. Her favorite was Daffy Duck. After leaving Warner Brothers, Chuck helped form an animation company that did for MGM Studios, including the new cartoons for the popular Tom and Jerry series. He also formed Chuck Jones Enterprises, which made animated specials for television, and produced and directed an award-winning animated film for MGM called The Dot and the Line, subtitled A Romance in Lower Mathematics. The Dot and the Line was based on a children's book of the same name by Norton Juster. The story is about a land in which the women were all dots and the men were all lines. A straight male line was in love with a female dot, but couldn't get her to notice him. Instead, the female dot hung out with a wild twiggly line. When the straight line discovered different shapes he could make by bending this way and that, he gained new confidence, and the female dot fell in love with him. The Dot and the Line was different from anything else Chuck had directed, because it included neither animals nor people. Chuck had already learned how to use animals' facial expressions to tell his stories. Bugs Bunny, Daffy Duck, or Pepe Le Pew needed only to raise an eyebrow or give the hint of a smile to indicate what Chuck was trying to say. Now he was capable of bringing human emotions to objects as simple as a dot and a line. The 10-minute short film was such a hit that Chuck won an Academy Award for it in 1965. A year later, Chuck reunited with Theodore Geisel to direct a television version of Dr. Seuss's book, How the Grinch Stole Christmas. Chuck's personal life took a sad turn in 1978 when Dorothy died at age 70. His work life continued to thrive, however, with the release of the Bugs Bunny/Roadrunner movie in 1979. It featured several classic Looney Tunes cartoons and a series of chase scenes featuring the Roadrunner and Wile E. Coyote. Bugs Bunny hosted the film in new scenes that Chuck helped write. How the Grinch Stole Christmas. Dr. Seuss's classic book, How the Grinch Stole Christmas, is often considered one of the best children's picture books of all time. It was first published in 1957. 9 years later, Chuck Jones worked with Theodore Dr. Seuss Geisel on an animated version of the book. The 26-minute cartoon special was originally shown on CBS television in 1966, and it too is now considered a classic. It is still shown many times on television each Christmas season. Film star Boris Karloff, who had played Frankenstein in the movies, narrated the story and recorded the voice of the Grinch. In 2000, How the Grinch Stole Christmas was the first Dr. Seuss book to be adapted into a full-length film, and the story was retold in 2006 on Broadway in Dr. Seuss' How the Grinch Stole Christmas the musical. In 1983, or 1981, Chuck married Marion Dern, who once had interviewed him for TV Guide magazine. Chuck and Marion enjoyed traveling and visited Europe, Australia, Japan, Mexico, and Canada together. In 1985, Chuck's work was featured in an exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art in New York City. And in 1992, What's Opera Dog became the first cartoon short ever added to the National Film Registry for its cultural and historical importance. What's Opera Doc had been made in 1957, sometimes referred to as Kill the Wabbit. The cartoon follows Elmer Fudd as he chases Bugs Bunny through the stories and sets of several operas. The music was based on an opera written by classical composer Richard Wagner, The songs are sung by Arthur Q. Bryan, the voice of Elmer Fudd, and Mel Blanc, who was the voice of Bugs Bunny. Mel Blanc, 1908 to 1989. Born Melvin Jerome Blanc in San Francisco, California, Mel Blanc began his career in radio when he was just 19 years old. He eventually became the voice of Bugs Bunny, Daffy Duck, Porky Pig, Yosemite Sam, Tweety Bird, Foghorn Leghorn, the Tasmanian Devil, and many other characters in Warner Brothers Looney Tunes cartoons. Blanc was nicknamed the Man of 1,000 Voices, and that wasn't much of an exaggeration, if at all. In cartoons alone, he was the voice of more than 400 characters. What's Opera Dog is considered to be one of the greatest cartoons, if not the greatest cartoon of all time. It introduced generations of children to the world of classical music, and it is considered to be the masterpiece of Chuck's career. Chapter 8. From Hair to Eternity. In 1996, at the age of 83, Chuck received an honorary Oscar at the Academy Awards for his Lifetime Achievements in Animation. Chuck's appearance drew a rousing ovation from the crowd. The Academy Awards. The Academy Awards, now called the Oscars, are the film industry's most important awards. Each year, the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences honors the year's best movies, directors, actors, artists, and technicians. It's the biggest night of the year for many people in the movie industry. The Academy Awards first presented in 1929. In 2013, the awards ceremony officially changed its name to the Oscars. Oscar is the nickname of the 13.5-inch gold statuette presented to each winner. In his lifetime, Chuck Jones won 2 Oscars, worked on 2 additional films that won Oscars, and worked on 6 others that were nominated. Many directors, actors, and modern animators in Hollywood had grown up watching the Looney Tunes and Merrie Melodies cartoons. Matt Groening, who helped create The Simpsons, and John Lasseter, whose Toy Story in 1995 was the first full-length computer animated feature, credit Chuck with inspiring their work. In 1997, From Hair to Eternity was the last cartoon that Chuck Jones directed. In it, Bugs Bunny and Yosemite Sam are both interested in finding the same treasure. When Chuck's directing days were over, he hardly stopped telling stories. In fact, he became very good at it. While he may not have been making movies with Bugs, Pepe, or Wile E. Coyote, he gladly shared his knowledge about them with fans, other animators, and journalists. He became a valuable source about what has come to be called the Golden Age of animation. In 2001, he was inducted into the Animation Hall of Fame in Los Angeles. When Warner Brothers closed its animation department in 1963, it has since been reopened. The company destroyed existing cells, original illustrations just to free up some space. Collectors and historians had lost many valuable pieces of animation art. Chuck spent time during his later years recreating many of the cells from his days with Leon Schlesinger Productions and Warner Brothers. They were sold or donated to charity. Late in his life, Chuck Jones still could have turned on the television almost any day of the week and found a channel playing classic Looney Tunes or Merry Melodies cartoons that probably would have surprised anybody who had worked at Termite Terrace. What we hoped was that our cartoons would have a life expectancy of 4 or 5 years, Chuck wrote, because in those simple yet wonderfully creative years before television, we made films solely for theatrical release. No one could have predicted the enduring popularity those short films would still have so many decades later. Chuck died of heart failure at age 89 in 2002, but more than 300 of his films as cartoons live on. His characters are often still found on television, clothing, and toys. In 2012, animation professionals celebrated what would have been Chuck's 100th birthday. And in January 2015, an exhibition called What's Up, Doc? The Animation Art of Chuck Jones closed a 6-month run at New York's Museum of the Moving Image. Chuck certainly was not thinking of such a lasting impact when he directed his cartoons for Warner Brothers. Since shorts were originally shown with many different features, including romantic comedies, murder mysteries, and westerns, he had no way of knowing who his audience would be in the theaters, and it never seemed to matter. Instead, the directors, writers, and animators simply thought that if they laughed, the audience would too. We weren't making them for kids or for adults, Chuck said. We were making them for ourselves. Chuck could see himself in Bugs Bunny, Roadrunner, Wile E. Coyote, Daffy Duck, Pepe Le Pew, or any of the many other characters he created or shaped for Warner Brothers. Those characters are extensions of myself, what I am or what I want to be, Chuck said. Indeed, Chuck Jones was a little bit of all of them. The end.